Gallier Hall, the formal seat of the Mardi Gras tradition. Gallier Hall on St. Charles Avenue is a magnificent example of James Gallier's Greek Revival architecture in New Orleans. Gallier Hall was the seat of government for the second municipality from 1836 until 1852. Then it was City Hall for the unified city of New Orleans until 1957, when it was renamed to Gallier Hall in honor of its architect, James Gallier Sr. Now it is primarily used as an event venue. Most significantly, it is the location of the Mardi Gras tradition of toasting the mayor. The tradition began the very first year the Krewe of Rex paraded in 1872, when the Grand Duke Alexei Romanov visited and viewed Rex and Comus from Gallier Hall, which was then City Hall. Even though City Hall moved to its current location in 1958, Gallier Hall remains the carnival tradition for the mayor and the Krewe royalty. The building features a portico with fluted Greek Ionic columns leading to a pediment with a relief sculpture of liberty, justice, and commerce. Architect James Gallier Sr. was born in 1798 in Ireland. James wrote an autobiography in 1864 detailing his family history, his education, and his accomplishments. He started school at age 4 and spent quite a lot of time in school as a child and as an adult. He seemed to value education, writing with some disgust about a time when he had no books, and his mind lay fallow for several years afterwards, he wrote. At age 18, he went to Manchester to find employment. He was employed to help build a cotton mill, which was one of the first. After he worked in Liverpool and his home before going back to school in 1820 at age 22. He next went to London, where he met and married his wife, Elizabeth Tyler. James Jr. was their third child, but the only one who survived to adulthood, and he was born in 1827 in Huntingdon, where James Sr. was working. The next year they returned to London. James went bankrupt in the 1830s, and he sought better opportunities in America. He writes, quote, "I clearly perceived, however, that though I might in time succeed in a small way and to a limited extent, I could never reckon upon any great success in London without the patronage of people in high station. And as with such people I had no influence, I saw it hopeless to expect much success in that direction. But having heard that any person well acquainted with the practice of building, as well as having a fair knowledge of architecture as an art, could scarcely fail of success in the United States of America, I therefore came to the conclusion that there lay the proper field for my labors." Unquote. James Gallier landed in New York on April 14, 1832, on a ship called Louisiana. His family followed him in July after he secured employment. In 1833, he wrote the American Builder's Price Book with the idea that if it wasn't profitable, it would earn him name recognition in this country. He also produced lectures on architecture while in New York. Quote, "It was then intimated to me by persons who had been to the South that New Orleans would be a much better place for me to settle in than New York, if I could only bear the climate. For though mercantile men went down there from the north every year, they generally remained during the winter months only, and returned northward in the summer to escape the yellow fever. This they continued to do until they had in some degree become acclimatized. But an architect could not do this. He must remain all the summer from his first beginning, as that was the season when the buildings were chiefly erected in New Orleans." Unquote. In 1834, the Galliers moved to New Orleans. James was still seeking prominence and recognition. He earned the contract to design and build the St. Charles Hotel because the president of the company and several chief stockholders were also Irish and took favor on their countrymen. The hotel was completed in 1836. In 1843, Elizabeth died. She and James Jr. had spent much of their time in the United States in New York because of her poor health. It was thought that the climate of New Orleans was not suitable for her health problems. She moved to New Orleans permanently to be with her husband and died soon after. In 1845, James was contracted to build the Municipal Hall. In 1850, he married Catherine Robinson in Charleston. In 1853, this building, now known as Gallier Hall, was finally completed. There is a legend in New Orleans that his family name was Gallier, and the Creoles changed it when he moved to New Orleans. But James used the name Gallier when he was in New York in 1833 before coming to New Orleans, and even in London in 1832 before heading to New York. How could the Creoles work this magic from afar? On the first page of his autobiography, Gallier dispels this myth thoroughly. He writes, quote, "A traditional record long in our family asserts that at a remote period our progenitors with others fled from Gaul to escape the tyranny of the Romans, that they proceeded westward first into Wales and thence into Ireland, where the habits and religions of the people so closely resembling their own, they settled upon tracts of land that had been liberally yielded to them by the hospitable Irish. Our name Gallier may still be found in those parts of France that stretch along the Pyrenees, and in Brittany. When certain portions of Ireland were conquered and taken possession of by the English, this name Gallier took the more English language, as then spoken in Ireland, the more guttural sound of Gallagher, which it has retained to the present time." Unquote. According to Google Translate, Gaul means foreigner in Irish. The name Gallagher translates to foreign helper. The Irish Rose provides this insight. Quote, "It is a matter of conjecture whether this appellation denoted merely an ally of strangers from other parts, or, as has been suggested, more particularly, a collaborator with the Norsemen, who were, in those days, raiding the coast of northwest Ireland." Unquote. The Gauls were not Norsemen, so perhaps this insight is just more confusion. Ultimately, unlike the New Orleans myth that the Creoles adopted Gallier and changed his name to French to show their appreciation, the Irish actually did that several centuries before, adopting the Galliers and turning their name Irish. There are good reasons that Gallier would revert to his ancestral name instead of carrying his Irish legacy to England and the United States. Anti-Irish sentiment existed for decades. "No Irish need apply" was long an acceptable line in want ads in newspapers. Irish were depicted as monkeys and gorillas in satirical cartoons, as well as violent drunks. But by at least the 1870s, discriminating against the Irish was already being criticized by progressive thinkers, the decade after the Galliers died. In his autobiography, Gallier goes on to list his family, starting with his second great-grandfather, Neil Gallier. His great-grandfather was Thaddeus, his grandfather was Patrick, and his father was also Thaddeus, who was born in 1763 and was still living when James wrote his autobiography, published in 1864. All of these men were born in Ireland. He wrote his memories of his grandfather, quote, "My paternal grandfather Patrick was of middle stature and remarkably active. Though a sort of jack of all trades, his chief occupation was, like that of his father, a dealer in cattle, which they bought in the interior of the island and prepared for the English market. I remember when a child the joyous delight in which I loved to place myself between his knees to listen to stories of the fierce encounters he had with wild cattle on his journeying through the interiors, and to the wondrous tales of witches and giants of which he possessed an inexhaustible fund." Unquote. James Gallier was a well-known architect in his day, but many of his buildings did not survive to the present day, such as the St. Charles Hotel, which burned in 1851. Some of his buildings that still exist are 824 Canal Street. Originally a private residence, it has been used as the home of the Boston Club since 1844, St. Patrick's Church on the other side of Lafayette Square from Gallier Hall, and, of course, Gallier Hall. He is remembered for his Greek Revival style in New Orleans. But James' most significant contribution is the concept of the architectural firm that operates independently of builders, a concept still employed today. Before, he explains in his autobiography, builders would employ draftsmen, or they would look for an existing construction and modify what they didn't like and replicate that. His model had the client employing the architect first and separate from the builder, and resulted in higher quality buildings. James's autobiography devolves into a travel diary after he married Catherine. He spends significant time discussing the quirks and interests of all the places he visited, with particular attention paid to his visit to the Egyptian pyramids. It was published in 1864. 2 years later, in 1866, James Sr. and Catherine were on a voyage from New York to New Orleans on a ship called the Evening Star. The ship sunk en route due to a hurricane, and almost everyone on board died, which included an unbelievable mix of people, such as an opera troupe, a ballet company, and dozens of trafficked sex workers, according to numerous accounts. James Gallier Jr. designed Gallier House on Royal Street, the French Opera House, which burned in 1919, and probably was the final architect on the Walter Grennan Robinson House in the Garden District. He died 2 years after his father, at age 40, probably of a stroke. He was originally buried in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 with his wife's family, but he was reinterred with his father in 1875, according to an exhibit at the old Ursuline Convent. Since James Sr. and Catherine were lost at sea, the Gallier Monument did not have remains until James Jr. was moved here. Elizabeth, James Jr.'s mother, was originally buried in the Girard Cemetery, but she was reinterred here when that cemetery was closed in the 1950s. A common myth told on cemetery tours is that the tomb is a memorial monument, not a tomb, because James and Catherine were lost at sea. However, according to the Archdiocese, not only is James Jr. buried here, but several descendants of the Galliers, the most recent buried in 2020, are interred here. Only James Sr. and Catherine and Elizabeth are inscribed. I think it's unlikely that James Jr. identified much with his Irish heritage, as he was born in England, had an English mother, grew up mostly in New York, and died in New Orleans. But both James Galliers are legendary in New Orleans. Gallier Hall and Gallier House both retain the name to this day. If you look under the portico of Gallier Hall, you will see that James Gallier signed his work. While he isn't really remembered as Irish, James's ancestry shows us that his family was Irish for generations. His name is still often repeated in New Orleans, as his contributions were substantial. Even those with only rudimentary architectural knowledge, like me, recognize his name in New Orleans in modern times. His masterpiece, Gallier Hall, is a defining part of the New Orleans cityscape, as well as Mardi Gras tradition.